Thanks everybody, who's joining, and I'm here in Morocco. Any of you are welcome in Morocco at any time. I always like to say outside of Siler City, Rabat, Morocco reminds me of home. And I'm really glad to be here tonight to share a little bit about my forthcoming book, McMasters Will, the scheme that almost freed us, and to really begin to tell the story of my family. And I'm really excited about this presentation because unlike other presentations where I've talked about the McMasters family, I don't have to spend a lot of time explaining where Siler City and Staley and all of these wonderful places are. And also, I'm looking forward to this presentation because I guarantee you that there are people who are on this call right now who know things about the events and the people and the places that I'm going to mention, which is why I'm going to make sure to leave lots of time for questions and answers, because I really want to hear from all of you. I want to thank the Chatham Public Libraries for this opportunity, for all the great work they're doing for all the time, but particularly in observance of Black History Month. And like I said, I want to thank everybody in attendance, especially I see a lot of good family members, cousins, and also a lot of good friends and folks that I know. And I really appreciate you being here. So I'm going to get started, and look, I put your questions in the chat, take note of them. Once we get to the end of the presentation, I can't wait to exchange with you and really talk about some of the issues that we're going to discuss tonight. So let's get started. What we're going to be talking about today is McMasters Will, the scheme that made us virtually free, that almost freed us. And so to get started, as the introduction said, Siler City, native, Duke University. I always remind people that Duke University is the University of North Carolina, just, so people have it clear. I did my Fulbright to Morocco, where I am now, over 20 years ago, and it's still a place that I love to come back to. I split my time between Washington, D.C., Rabat, Morocco, and of course, Siler City. President of RC Communications. We're a communications and public relations firm based in Washington, D.C. And of course, author of the forthcoming book, which is one of the most fulfilling projects I've ever done, McMasters Will, the scheme that almost freed us. I want to really, during this presentation, I want to really talk about why this is important for Black History Month. And some of the things that I want you to keep in mind as we're discussing this is we need to be able to all find pride and things to be proud of with difficult history. Sometimes we want to sweep things under the rug or be ashamed of them. You can still have pride in difficult history. Also, before you can own it, you got to know it. So we're going to try to do a little bit of that today. We're going to know the history, and then we're going to try to own it just a little bit. I was always told, let the sleeping dogs lie, but we're going to wake some of them up. So we're going to wake up sleeping dogs as far as history is concerned. And I hope that we all, no matter what our background, African-American, non-African-American, whatever your background is, that we have a better understanding for all. Now, what you can expect from this presentation is you're going to meet the McMasters, my family, particularly my mother's side. Our origin story, you're going to hear a lot about that, where we came from. We're going to talk a little bit about what is freedom, because it's not always clear exactly what that is. We're going to talk about Quakers and the role that they played in the anti-slavery movement in central North Carolina, particularly in Chatham County. And then also along the way, I'll share some family research tips, because as many of you, I'm sure, do genealogy, family history, it is now the #1 hobby of Americans. And I'm happy about that. So I'm also wanting to share some of the tips that I've learned in my family history research journey. Now, like I said, this is what I love, because when I normally talk about McMasters Will, I have this map which says, Chatham and Randolph counties, and I show people where most of what I'm going to talk about is taking place. And most people who don't have connection to the area look at it and they say, okay, it's in the center of North Carolina. But I love doing this here today because we can really get down to it, where we're talking about places that I know that many of you are familiar with, have connections to. And as you see by the red circle that I have there, right on the Chatham Randolph County line, community, a little town called Staley, North Carolina. This is where a lot of the story takes place. And actually with the land and the property and the houses that we're going to be talking about, the county line runs right through them. So this is truly right there at the Randolph and Chatham County lines. Now, as I said, this presentation is special, particularly because I know that there are people who have joined today that are going to know more about these issues and these events and these people than I do. And so I put together this list of family names that are directly related to McMasters Will and our origin story. And I just want you to take note and see if you are in any of these families, or if you know people from any of these families. And I'm sure that you do. So I look forward to your questions if you see a family name, or if you're a part of one of the families listed there. So to just introduce you to my McMasters family, if I had to describe us, I would say we're proud people, we're very close, and we value knowledge. And sometimes knowledge is education. Sometimes that's formal or informal. Reading was always something that was valued, and in my family, the McMasters were known for, and I'm proud of that. And that kind of explains a little bit about who we are. One of the places that I find it is very dear to me is the old home place. It's Grandpa Amos and Grandma Maggie McMasters' house in Staley, right there on the Chatham Randolph County line. And our reunions, they're epic. And some of my earliest memories are of the reunions. And as you see here, I wanted to share, that I have been instrumental in researching the McMasters family history from an early age. This is me and my mother. I'm food testing some fried chicken, it looks like, because I've taken family history research real serious, including at our reunions. And then, of course, there's another great photo of the fellowship that we have that is centered around everyone knowing a little bit more about the history and where we come from. This is also a picture that was taken at one of the reunions that I just find very special. It's my mother, who's on the left there in the white jacket, and then our first cousins. As I said, we're very proud and close family, and we're very good-looking family, and that's subjective. It's not just my opinion. You can see from the picture. So what I want to do is I want to tell you a story. It's a story about Aaron McMasters. He was my great-great-grandfather. He was born around 1814, right there on the Randolph Chatham County line. Now, he was enslaved because his mother, my great-great-grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother, Creasy McMasters, who was born around, in the 1790s, was enslaved. Now, the way that North Carolina worked when it came to if someone was determining whether or not you were a slave, it depended on a legal principle called partus sequitur ventrum, which is Latin for that which comes forth follows the womb. So Aaron was a slave because his mother was a slave, and that's how it was passed down. That's the way it was recognized in North Carolina. Now, the story with Aaron McMasters is very fascinating. And one of the reasons why I think it's just such an incredible story is because there's so many places that you can start. And my favorite place that I like to start is on February the 10th, 1852. So what happened on February 10th, 1852? Well, my great-great-grandpa Aaron received a letter from a Quaker confidant. And the Quaker confidant was named Jesse Kemp. And that's a picture of the letter that was sent, and Jesse Kemp and his wife, Elizabeth. And by the way, as I was talking about with our family and how, we've always really valued history and we discuss these things, I have to give a shout out to my cousin, Dr. Howard McMasters, who's a keeper of a lot of our great family history and has shared this with me from the very beginning of my life. So I'm very appreciative of that. With this letter from Jesse Kemp, he was writing from Park County, Indiana, and he was dealing with a very, very difficult thing. He was trying to give advice to Aaron McMasters, my great-great-grandfather. Now, I want to read just a little bit of the letter. And I want you to picture Aaron McMasters, who at this time is in his late 30s, living right there on the Chatham Randolph County line. And what's happened is he is a slave. And Jesse Kemp is trying to convince him to leave North Carolina because it is no longer safe, and that he believes Aaron will have a better life if he comes to Ohio or Indiana. And so I want to read just the first part of the letter so you can see exactly what Jesse Kemp was trying to say. He says, "Respected friend, Aaron McMasters, thy letter dated September 29th, 1851 has been received, and after some consideration, I saw purpose to answer it. Thee request my views relative to thy coming to this country, which I very willingly give thee. My opinion in regard has not changed. I have, ever since the death of thy master, Simeon McMasters," that was Aaron's slave master, "felt a great anxiety for thee to move to some free government, and I give it as my opinion that it would be wise in thee to leave North Carolina," or to leave Carolina, as he said. Now, the letter goes on to talk about the reasoning, and I just thought it was really interesting that you have this white Quaker who's in Indiana trying to convince Aaron to flee, to leave North Carolina. And parts of the letter that I just highlighted here really show you the urgency in his words and the honesty. He says, "I am sorry to say that there is great prejudice in this country against colored people. If I were of that black complexion, I would prefer Canada to Carolina or any other slave state beyond our calculation." And he goes on to say, "If I were in thy place and knew what I do know, I would come to Ohio or Indiana. And if I did not find that to suit me, I would go to Canada, which can be done in a few days from here." So great-great-grandpa Aaron had a really difficult choice to make. Does he stay in North Carolina? Does he try to find a new life in a state that is free? He would have his legal freedom, but wasn't going to be a welcoming place. Would he be willing to go to Canada if necessary, if Ohio or Indiana didn't work out? And you see the map here just to show you what it would have taken. This was one of the routes that a lot of Quakers and those who worked with the Underground Railroad took. And it would have taken about 6 weeks. It would have been about 700 miles, and a lot of that on foot, because while they did, of course, use wagons drawn by horses, all of their stuff was in the wagons. People were expected to walk alongside of it. So that in itself would be very arduous and factored into Aaron's decision. Now, before you make the decision, before you think about what decision Aaron McMasters should have made about leaving North Carolina and leaving slavery, like any good storyteller, I've got to be honest, there are 4 things that you need to know. The first is Grandma Creasy can't go. He is there taking care of his mother. and she was not in of good enough health to be able to make that 700-mile journey. So if he left North Carolina, he would have to leave his mother. Second thing you need to know, Simeon McMasters was more than great-grandpa Aaron's enslaver, slave master. He was also his biological father. Thing three, Jesse Kim, the Quaker confidant who wrote the letter that I just read from, wasn't just Aaron's Quaker confidant. He was now Aaron's new slave master. And the fourth thing, all of this was supposed to be resolved by a scheme by friends and friends of friends. And when I say friends with the capital F, that's referring to members of the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers. So let's now see what exactly Aaron did and what this scheme was about to try to get him to freedom. First, real quick, just want to talk about a little bit about Simeon McMasters, the slave owner, the enslaver. He was Scottish American. He was born around 1767. He was one of 14 children, which is why the McMasters name is very, very well known in central North Carolina. And most McMasters who live in Chatham, Randolph, Guilford County are descended from Simeon's family, one of those families of those 14 children. Now, Simeon was married at an early age to a white woman who died very early without giving him legal issue, which was a term used at that time for basically a legal heir, a child that lived. Aaron was not recognized as his son because he was not considered a citizen or a full human being with rights. So Simeon was a widower in around 1834. And the problem that he ran into was that he wanted to make sure that Creasy and Aaron were taken care of when he died. Now, if I were to describe the McMasters family, the families that came from the 14 siblings, they were very numerous, lots of course, siblings, but then they also had a lot of children. So Aaron and Creasy were surrounded by the McMasters family. They had all sorts of occupations. There was farmer, minister, doctor, there was even a justice of the peace. They were very active around Randolph and Chatham County. And as I said, Aaron and Creasy were surrounded by the McMasters. And Simeon McMasters, in around 1834, he made a promise to Aaron and his mother Creasy that when he died, he would make sure that they received their freedom. Now, a lot of times in movies and sometimes TV shows and books about slavery, it's depicted that if you are a slave master, if you want to free somebody that you have been holding as a slave, you just do it. You just sign whatever needs to be signed, say whatever needs to be said. That wasn't the case in North Carolina. This is because North Carolina had very strict emancipation laws, because what they realized around the turn of the 19th century and 1800s, that when people were trying to free those that they held enslaved, they of course stayed in North Carolina, and they were afraid that these now freed former slaves would revolt, that they would cause a rebellion. And so North Carolina put in place very strict emancipation laws. And just to let you know a little bit about the process that Simeon would have had to go through, he would have had to file a petition with the county court in Asheboro. He would have had to pay a $1,000 bond for each enslaved person to be freed. So that would have been $2,000 in bonds for Aaron and for Creasy. And that was an amount that was out of reach for most people in North Carolina. Simeon at the time, he was a blacksmith. He had a blacksmith shop. He had about 150 acres of land, and all of that wasn't even worth $750. So imagine the cost of then having to put up $1,000 per enslaved person bond in North Carolina. And then there was a removal requirement, which made it even more difficult. If an enslaver did petition the court if they did put up the bond, the enslaved person who was freed had 90 days to leave North Carolina forever and never return. And if that enslaved person formerly enslaved person returned, not only would the enslaver lose whatever they put up for that bond, but the formerly enslaved person would be sold back into slavery. This was to discourage people from freeing those they enslaved. Now, there were exceptions to this. There was a meritorious service, which if you could prove that the person that you held that was enslaved had done something above and beyond the call of duty. Some of the examples that I've seen in records were there was an enslaved person who went in to save his master's family and possessions when the house caught on fire. There was another where someone had stopped someone else from drowning. These are like extraordinary acts, but that was only if the enslaved person was over 50. Okay, so that may have applied for great-great-great-grandma Creasy, but not for Aaron. And you had to substantiate it. You had to exactly prove that they had meritorious service. The other kind of exception was you could get a special act of the North Carolina General Assembly, which meant you could write whoever your representative was and make a case to say this person should be emancipated because of X, Y, Z. But it was very rare, and as you can imagine, very hard to do. So we now have Simeon, who is on his deathbed, has made a promise to Aaron and Creasy that they're going to be free, but now he has to figure out a way to do it. Now, put a pin in that for just a second. Before we go into the scheme, got to tell you who the Quakers are for those of you who may not be familiar. Quakers are known as a society of friends, and just three things that I think are important to kind of know about Quakers if you're not familiar with the Society of Friends is they were pacifist, and they really valued plainness in the way they spoke, in the way they lived, in the way that they dressed. You'll often see the term meetings described when you're talking about Quakers, and meetings were essentially congregations. So as you know, there's like Rocky River Friends meeting near where I grew up. There's Cane Creek Friends meeting. When you see the term meetings, these are congregations. And then there were state level levels to these congregations, like the North Carolina Yearly Meeting, for example. And I think disownment, that's something that is important to keep in mind, because as Quakers decided that they wanted to take a firm stance against slavery, you could be disowned for having people who were enslaved. You could also be disowned for marrying out of unity, as they called it, marrying somebody who's not a Quaker, and other offenses. What's really good, and this goes into one of the tips about doing your family history research, I would encourage each of you to take a look at what's called Henshaw's Encyclopedia of Quaker Genealogy, and there's also records online. Some are free. Family Search has it. If you have a subscription to Ancestry, they have it as well, where you can search for names and places, and there may be relatives, people that you're looking for, where you can find information about them from the Encyclopedia of Quaker Genealogy. And it didn't just cover people who were Quaker. Sometimes covered people who were kicked out for marrying or doing something that involved a non-Quaker, and you can also find those names. Now, there was a lot of ignorance about Quakers because people sometimes didn't trust them. They didn't really understand what they were about because Quakers didn't swear oaths. They didn't perform military service. And like I said, they valued plainness. So they did not really seek to have a lot of worldliness about them and the things that they did. Now, why did Quakers oppose slavery? And this is not just for the Quakers, there are many other denominations that had similar thoughts about slavery, but if I could just talk about the 5 things that I think really, really made it clear to the Quakers of why having slaves was not what they were supposed to be doing as people of faith. It's that all people are spiritually equal before God. That's something that they believed. And of course, slavery was not compatible with that. They also believed that maintaining slavery and having slaves encouraged violence because it was a very violent institution. They also believed that it was contrary to plain living. Remember, these are people that value plainness, and having servants, people that you own to work for you, was contrary to plain living. They also believed that it broke the golden rule because you're supposed to treat people as you want to be treated, which is obviously does not match what happened in slavery. And they also believed that, which was true, that slavery broke up enslaved families because people were sold, families were split up, and it also encouraged adultery. That was another reason, because you had enslavers who took advantage of people who were enslaved because they didn't have a choice, didn't have agency to make those decisions. So for those reasons, this is why Quakers opposed slavery. Now, who were the Quaker free Negroes? So what happened with the Quakers is, internally they condemned gradually slavery. In 1776, the North Carolina Yearly Meeting, as you see there, made slaveholding a disownable offense. You could be disowned from a Quaker meeting. They decided that they were going to try to figure out a way to do their part for the anti-slavery efforts. And just very briefly, what that meant was there were trusteeships, meaning that they would tell slave owners, this is $1,000 bond per enslaved person, and the removal requirement to leave after 90 days. That's very onerous. A lot of people don't have that. They can't do that. So how about leave your enslaved people to us as trustees, and then they'll still be enslaved, but we'll treat them better. We'll educate them, and we'll try to set them up for a life that's not quite free, but it's better than being enslaved. They also did a little bit with colonization, meaning that once enslaved people were freed, maybe they should be sent away. Some were sent to the north, some were sent to Liberia, some were sent to Haiti. A lot of those efforts were not successful in large numbers because it was really expensive. And also, one of the things that Quakers had to deal with was if you made a condition that, to be freed from slavery, you had to go to a foreign country, place you'd never known, that was pressuring the enslaved people to do something that they didn't necessarily want to do. That really didn't match with some of the things we talked about, the golden rule, treating people how you want to be treated, and that all people were equal in the eyes of God. And one of the other things that they tried was movement to the West. Around the 1830s, Quakers started moving towards Indiana and Ohio for various reasons, but one in particular was that after the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia, slavery and maintaining it and fighting against it became more and more violent. And for people who were pacifists, they saw that in central North Carolina, that they would not be able to avoid being in these violent confrontations. So that's why a lot of Quakers migrated to the West. I encourage each of you, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Sword of Peace near the Cane Creek community in Alamance County. That story and that history is about some of these anti-slavery efforts, and it's worth looking into if you haven't already been familiar with it. Now, one of my favorite lines from the minutes of the North Carolina Yearly Meeting was once they had asked people to say, okay, you can't legally free your enslaved people, so leave them to us. And, the Quaker congregation will own them. Well, so many people tried to start doing it that, believe it or not, in the early 1800s, the largest single holder of enslaved people in North Carolina was the North Carolina Yearly Meeting, the Quakers. And one of the notes from one of the observations in the minutes was the having of Negroes is become a burden because it was becoming financially unstable, and it just wasn't a practical way to have people freed from slavery. So they decided they wanted a new ecumenical way, meaning how can we fight slavery outside of Quakers? How can we get people who are not Quakers to get into the anti-slavery movement? That's where we come to the idea of friends and friends of friends. And this will make sense, but keep in mind, we got to get back to Simeon McMasters, who needs some way to free Aaron and Creasy. Friends, of course, are Quakers, Society of Friends, but then friends of friends are those who were not Quakers, but shared Quaker values when it dealt with anti-slavery. So when they thought about a way, they said, okay, how can we get people to join us who would be afraid to come, and join Quakers because they don't really know what they're about? They said, let's create a group called the North Carolina Manumission Society. It was based on similar societies that had been set up in Tennessee. And this first meeting of the North Carolina Manumission Society was in July of 1816, right in Guilford County. I was there not too long ago looking at the spot where this meeting first started. They were composed of Quakers and non-Quakers, and they all had chapters and branches and delegates from the different Quaker communities. So, there was Loves Creek, Cane Creek, New Garden, a lot of the Rocky River, a lot of the Quaker communities that you're probably familiar with had branches of the North Carolina Manumission Society, and they each sent delegates to these meetings. And what they decided is they said, through the North Carolina Manumission Society, we're going to help people get around the law in North Carolina to free the people they had enslaved. Now, their mission, just to briefly describe what they wanted to do, they believed in manumission, which is when an enslaver frees the person they enslave; gradualism, which means that, gradually slavery would have ended, kind of like phased out; amelioration, which are like, if we can't really get rid of slavery, let's make it to where it's not as bad, as it's not as practiced as violently as it was at the time; emancipation, of course, that's freeing those who are enslaved, but from the government. So it's not the enslaver, but a government body says, people are freed. And there was, of course, abolition, which is getting rid of the institution of slavery. And then immediatism, that meant right now, not the gradualism, but we need to free the people who are enslaved as soon as possible. The way that they did this was they wanted to persuade public opinion. They were a lobbying group. They were trying to convince people who held slaves and those who had influence on those who held slaves to if they couldn't free them by North Carolina law, at least try to do something to where slavery wouldn't be as violent as it was. And the North Carolina Manumission Society, they had a lot of controversies as they got started. One of the things is they couldn't exactly agree with all the things that I just talked about, which was the most important goal. And so their name changed a lot. They were the North Carolina Manumission Society, then they were the North Carolina Manumission and Colonization Society, because they thought, well, maybe we'll just raise money and send enslaved people to Haiti and Liberia and to the north, or maybe even to the west. That didn't work because it cost too much. One of the names that they had for about 2 years that I just thought was too much to put on a business card is the Manumission Society of North Carolina for promoting the gradual emancipation of slavery and for ameliorating the condition of the African race among us. Imagine that announcement in the local paper about that meeting. Now, the North Carolina Manumission Society had some controversies. One of the biggest was they wanted slave owners, enslavers, to be members. And of course, you had some people who were, of course, fighting slavery in the group, and they're saying, why are we letting the slave masters be a part of our anti-slavery group? Well, the leaders of the organization said, if we can convince them, they are the ones that can convince their fellow slave masters and slave owners and enslavers to free those they enslaved. Colonization, as I said, was really expensive. That was another controversy. Too gradual. Some people said, if we really believe that slavery does not represent what we should be doing as people of faith, as Christians, then we shouldn't say, well, we're just going to let it taper off. We need to do it like right now. And some people left the North Carolina Manumission Society because of this. And one of the most famous was Levi Coffin. He's kind of the unofficial president of the Underground Railroad, just because he couldn't fathom, why you would have slave masters and enslavers in a group whose goal was to end slavery. Okay. Now, One of the things, if you see the graphic that I have here, it says, look at this. A lot of people would think, okay, well, this was like an underground group, trying to keep it secret. Exactly the opposite. They wanted to be well known. They wanted people to know what they wanted to do. And that announcement talks about the General Association of the Manumission Society of North Carolina will be held at Ebenezer Meeting House in Randolph County. And they give the date and they give all the information. So this was not a secret. They wanted to be a public lobbying group. When it came to the role of women, they were actually very ahead of their time. They allowed women to have auxiliary branches, and they allowed women to petition the North Carolina State Legislature and U.S. Congress on issues that they thought pertained to the women's role in the house. And that was that family separation, adultery, fornication were negative consequences of slavery that they stood up against. And they believed education should be something that should have been taught to children and adults, no matter what their race. So Simeon McMasters, sitting there in Staley, he hears about this group, the North Carolina Manumission Society. He contacts them and he says, I'm on my deathbed. I have Aaron and Creasy and I want to free them, but I don't have the money to put up the bond. Also, I can't free Creasy because she won't be able to leave North Carolina within 90 days. And then she would never be able to return, even if she could leave. So at the time that Simeon goes to the North Carolina Manumission Society, the president was a man named Benjamin Swain, which is probably one of the most interesting people that I've met during this research of my family history. His nickname was the Man of Business. And the reason was he was an attorney, he was an author, and he was a newspaper publisher. And he created what I would call the 19th century version of LegalZoom. What he wanted to do was, he said, there's a lot of pretty routine things that lawyers need to do for people, like, wills, deeds, trust, all that kinds of thing. And, it was expensive. So he's like, what if I put together a book with like basic advice on the legal process and put, examples of forms so that people won't have to go and pay a lawyer to do it all the time. And he wrote the book called The Man of Business. Not only was he known for doing things like wills and deeds, but he also was very, very, he was a champion of the anti-slavery movement. And he, at the time that Simeon McMasters was looking for help, just happened to be the president of the North Carolina Manumission Society. So here's what happens. Simeon McMasters goes to him and says, I need a scheme. I need to get around North Carolina law because I've got to free, or at least secure the freedom of the 2 enslaved people that I have before I die. And so Benjamin Swain says, okay, I have a way, I think, that we can get around North Carolina law, but it's going to require you to be real quiet about this scheme. Nobody can know about it. It can't be revealed until you die. And we're going to need people to help, okay? Now, incidentally, Simeon's brothers and sisters and his nieces and nephews and cousins that lived all around him, none of them wanted to help. In fact, they let him know that as soon as he died, Aaron Creasy, that blacksmith shop, that 150 acres, where we have our family reunions from the Masters family, all that was going to be divided upon with the white McMaster family. So Benjamin Swain said, I've got a scheme. We're going to need some people to like help us do it. And we're going to call them the trusty friends. And what he did was he selected a man named Jesse Kemp, who was a Quaker, who wrote the letter from the beginning of the presentation that we talked about. A man named Hezekiah S. Clark, who was a Quaker. A man named Henry Ellison, non-Quaker, he was nominally Methodist, and John Miller, who was non-Quaker. Now, what was supposed to happen with these trusty friends? Here in this graphic, you can see where I kind of zoomed in on a part of the scheme, the will that Benjamin Swain, the man of business, created. It says trusty friends. At the time, trusty friends was like normal legal boilerplate that you would find in wills, kind of like saying, these are my administrators, executors of my estate. But this had a double meaning. They were the trusty friends because they were part of the North Carolina Manumission Society that was run by Quakers, and 2 of the 4 were Quakers. So these were the trusty friends. This is what I meant by friends and friends of friends. So here's how the scheme was supposed to work, okay? It had one purpose: free Aaron and Creasy from slavery when Simeon McMasters died. Now, the first part of the will said they should be legally free, and they should get my 150 acres and everything that I have. That's mine, it should be theirs. That was against the law, and it said, okay, if that happens to be against the law when I die, this is Simeon McMasters saying it, I want them to be virtually free. And what virtually free meant, virtual freedom was a term coined by Professor John Hope Franklin. I had the honor of being one of his students in one of the last classes that he taught at Duke University. He coined the term virtual freedom, which meant people who were enslaved were allowed to live as if they were free. People may not have even realized that they were enslaved, but it was just because of an understanding of the white people around them. They weren't legally free. You can imagine how dangerous that was, because if somebody disagreed or you stepped out of line, you weren't really free and you weren't able to protect your rights and stand up for your rights as a free citizen. That's why they call it virtual freedom. Now, what the will said was, if Aaron and Creasy can be freed, great. They get everything that Simeon has. Second, if they can't be legally freed, then what we're going to do is we're going to give them to those 4 trusty friends, and they're going to pretend to be their slave owners and let them live as free. And they were going to go through the whole charade to pretend that they were really their slave masters, but what they really weren't. They were just slave masters on paper. That was the plan. And also in the will, disown the whole McMasters family, all those other 13 brothers and sisters, every one of their children, nieces, nephews, cousins, everything. And they all lived around Aaron and Creasy. So you can already imagine the family drama that's going to cause when this will is read publicly. So it was signed, sealed in 1834. The scheme was there. Everybody just had to keep quiet about it. So here comes August 1840. Simeon McMasters has now died. And now the scheme is going to be made public. Now, let me tell you this. In those 6 years, so much has changed. The North Carolina Manumission Society disbanded. It doesn't exist anymore. They couldn't agree on the best way to fight slavery. And actually, one of the last things they did was to develop this scheme for Aaron and Creasy. So they're no longer around. Second thing, Jesse Kemp, who wrote the letter, and Hezekiah S. Clark, the other Quaker, had already gone. They left North Carolina. They went west. They went to Indiana. They were tired of life in North Carolina and the violence that slavery was causing in Randolph and Chatham County and the surrounding communities. And then the third thing, did the McMasters family find out about the will? Well, they did when it was read and made public. So what happened? The McMasters family took it to court. They went to Asheboro, county seat, of course, at the time in Randolph County. They tried to say that Simeon's will was not real, that it was not valid, that this was not something that their relative would have tried to do, to not only leave that the enslaved people would be freed, but that he was going to leave everything he had to them. Well, guess what? The will was written by Benjamin Swain, the man of business, the legal scholar about wills in Randolph and the surrounding counties. And Benjamin Swain came to court and said, oh, it's real because I wrote it. And I can tell you that not only is it legally sound, but Simeon McMasters asked me to write it. So then once they decided, okay, the will is real, who's going to pay the bond? Because one of the things the trusty friends hadn't decided before Simeon died was if they were going to try to free Aaron and Creasy, they needed to pool their money to come up with $2,000 worth of either property or cash to put up the bond to free Aaron and Creasy. None of them wanted to put it up. And the reason none of them wanted to put it up was because Aaron said he wasn't leaving his mother. my great-great-great-grandmother Creasy. And then they said, if we put up this $2,000 worth of, if we pool our resources and say Aaron does leave to, go to Park County, Indiana, what if he comes back to check on his mother? Then we lose that. He goes back into slavery, and so does his mother stay in slavery. So the trusty friends are fighting amongst themselves as to who's going to pay the bond. And so what results is a really, really confusing lawsuit. And you see an excerpt from the paper in Asheboro, North Carolina, where it says John Miller, executed the last will and testament of Simeon McMasters, deceased, against, and he lists all of those brothers, sisters, cousins, nieces, and nephew, John McMasters, Isaiah Piggott, David McMasters, Daniel McMasters, Jonathan McMasters, everybody. So they're all suing everybody over Aaron because half of them don't believe he and his mother should be freed, and the other half, who believe that he should be freed, don't want to put the money up to comply with North Carolina law. And if all of that wasn't enough, here's where it gets even more interesting. Some members of the McMasters family said, I think the way that we can win this and make sure that Aaron and Creasy don't get freed, let's make an accusation in court that will surely let the world know that Aaron did not deserve to be freed. And here's the allegation they made. And I'm going to read it to you. This is taken from the court documents. It says, they were talking about other said slaves, and the evil effects of this come as the defendants, this was the McMasters family, are informed and have found that by the slave Aaron has been charged with being the father of children by white women. And in one case, a white woman actually has sworn her child to said Aaron. Now, can you imagine in 1843 what this allegation in public in the courthouse in Asheboro, what that would have meant for Aaron, that he not only was having relations with white women, but that had fathered children, plural, by white women. They had a white woman who was ready to testify. Now, let me tell you this. On behalf of the McMasters family, when I read this accusation, I was just shocked. And I want to tell you that it was meant to put Aaron's life in danger. It was meant to sully his reputation. And he was also 100% true. Great-great-grandpa Aaron had a relationship with a woman named Wincy Ann Cavanis, okay? Now remember, partus sequitur ventrum, your status as enslaved or free depended on your mother. She was a white woman. She was from Moore County. And what happened was, in her life, she had claimed that when she was a young girl, she saw her father and her uncle beat an enslaved man to death. And she said that she vowed right then that she would never give birth to another potential slave owner. In other words, she wanted children, but she said their fathers had to be not white. So in this case, they had to be Black. So she had actually had Aaron's child. And Aaron's child was named Cynthia McMasters Phillips. And she ended up living in Moore County, and I'll share a little bit in the pictures. So the allegations that they made were absolutely true in court. And when I was researching it, not only did I find about her and about the child that was born between Wincy Ann Cavanis and Aaron McMasters, but I found another one. There was another white woman who lived on the other side of where the McMasters land was, named Patsy Lineberry. And she had a child by Aaron. And remember, partus sequitur ventrum, she was a white woman. So the child, even though it was mixed, was not enslaved because their mother was white. And that child was named Nathaniel Lineberry. And we have apprenticeships here. Just want to let you know that one of the ways that North Carolina tried to deal with people who were of mixed race and their mother was white, so they weren't enslaved, but they didn't want them to have the rights of white people. they created apprenticeships because they said anybody who would enter into a relationship to have a mixed child clearly is not a good parent. So they would take those children and place them with farmers and people of other occupations to teach them a trade, to teach them how to be respectable citizens, because clearly their parents weren't, according to the law. And these apprenticeships were just another way of putting these mixed children in a situation that looked exactly like slavery. But let me tell you what happened with Nathaniel Lineberry. When they found him, after they found Patsy Lineberry, and he's a mixed child, they said, we've got to put him in as an apprenticeship. Somehow, Aaron McMasters was able to convince the white court to say, assign him next door to a man named John Staley, whose family lived next door to the McMasters. So Aaron got to be with his son and grow up with him. One, as Aaron is an enslaved person, and then his son, who wasn't enslaved, but was in an apprenticeship with a white family. And I just want to put this up from the court records, just to show you how serious this was. They couldn't find Patsy Lineberry, because what would happen is when people found out that their children were mixed race and that the father was Aaron, who was a slave, they would hide. And so they hid between Chatham, Randolph, Orange, and Moore counties. And this was from one of the orders from the court, where they said the sheriff ordered to bring to next court 2 mulatto children of Katie and Patsy Lineberry in the eastern part of the county, names of children not known. So this was a very active effort to find these mixed children of Aaron McMasters. So while all this is going on in court, when I told you about virtual freedom, Aaron's allowed to live on Simeon's property while they're going through court, and he's virtually free, meaning that he's still legally enslaved, but Simeon had taught him how to be a blacksmith, so he had his blacksmith business, and he was running the farm and everything on those 150 acres. And when the case is resolved, it goes all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court. The North Carolina Supreme Court says, you know what? We're not going to decide between who's going to pay the bond, because that's not our job. We're also not going to really decide if the Quakers are real slave owners or if they're just fake slave owners in this scheme to defraud North Carolina. We think they are, because it mentions that they're Quakers and Quakers don't have slaves, but they're like, we can't prove that. So what Aaron does, he figures out a way to make an agreement with the McMasters family to say, okay, how about this? I get to stay here with my mother. I get to stay on this land, and you can share it with me. There's a spring there. It was a very valuable piece of land. Said, I'll share it with you. I'll even do work for you in the blacksmith shop and other things. Even Creasy, she said she would be hired out as a maid and a cook in their houses. And I have some of the records. She hired herself out for $6 for 6 months. So she was $1 a month that she earned for her work. And so Aaron was able to negotiate his virtual freedom. And you remember I told you in the beginning that we were going to talk a little bit about what does freedom mean? Aaron now, since the court case is closed, is living there, and instead of getting legal freedom that he could have had in Ohio and Indiana, he had virtual freedom where he was still enslaved, but he was able to stay in North Carolina. But it only worked as long as the white people around him, McMasters and other families, agreed to it. Because the minute he stepped out of line, they could, have him up. They could take him to court. He had no rights other than what they acknowledged that they were willing to give him, as long as he stayed within the lines that they set of behavior. Okay. And just to show you how great grandpa Aaron really mastered this virtual freedom, if you look in the census records for him in like 1850, it lists him as head of a free household, because when the census taker came around, they didn't know about the scheme. He was virtually free, but a lot of people didn't know the story after time had passed. So people thought he was free, even though he really wasn't. There's an accounting book that I was able to see from a white merchant in Randolph County that showed dealings with Aaron, that Aaron would trade making things in his blacksmith shop for things that he needed in the house. And most of the time in these records, if it listed someone who was African-American, it would indicate that they were a slave or that they were of color. Doesn't list it at all. And what's interesting is it even lists Aaron loaning money and tools to his cousins, the white McMasters. So for some reason, Aaron figured out a way to appease them and was living and working as what a lot of people thought was a free man, even though he wasn't legally free. And one of the biggest examples to show you how great this was that Aaron was able to convince the white people to let him be virtually free is this marriage announcement. Aaron, when it came time for him to get married, and the only legal marriage he could have was with not only a Black woman, but they also had to be of the same status. So it had to be a Black woman who was enslaved. They put his wedding announcement in the paper, and I'll read it, you can see in the graphic. It says, in Randolph County on the 26th of May, by the Reverend Shubal G. Evans, Aaron McMaster, Esquire, which at the time just meant it was an honorific for gentlemen, to Miss Ruth A. Harris of Chatham. Now think about it. There were a lot of white people that got married and didn't rise to the level of notoriety to have their marriage announcement put in the local paper. They put it in there for Aaron. And notice they don't even indicate that he is of color or that he's enslaved. And if you're wondering how in the world did that happen, well, Reverend Shubal G. Evans, who married them, was also one of the local pastors that fought against slavery. So all of those people in the Manumission Society that had tried to help Aaron, he was one of them. So it's no wonder that when he had to put in his weekly column of who died and who got married and who was born, he put Aaron and now my great-great-grandmother Ruth McMasters in there just like he would any other prominent people in the community. Now, one of the things that we have to keep in mind throughout all of this is even while Aaron was able to negotiate with the white people around him, there were people outside of Randolph and Chatham counties that did not like what they heard about this huge case of this enslaved person and his mother, who's now sitting on 150 acres, having more in wealth and land than the white people around them. And one of the examples was there was a family of slave traders in what's now Greensboro called the Weatherlys. And if you look at the graphic here, just to show you how prolific these slave traders were, they put this advertisement in the Ashboro paper, and I'll read it. It says, $75,000 to give for 100 number one Negro girls, 16 to 18 years of age. Letters addressed to subscriber Greensboro, North Carolina will be promptly attended to. Joseph A. Weatherly. Now, let me tell you this. It's 1852. It's been 10 years since the court case. Aaron and Creasy are doing pretty well with managing with the white people around them, and they're in this virtual freedom situation, right? Well, one of Simeon's nephews, one of the McMasters who lives next door, dies suddenly, didn't leave a will, and he left his family in debt. Now, that McMaster family, they had their own enslaved people. They had 4. And can you imagine what it was like for those 4 enslaved people to be living beside Aaron and his mother, Creasy? They're all enslaved, but Aaron is treated as if he's virtually free. Well, this McMasters family, David McMasters, when it came time to settle his debts, the court said, you're in debt and you've got to sell something. And the most valuable thing he had were those slaves. And so he called on Joseph Weatherly from Greensboro to have an auction at the house to sell. They ended up selling one of the most valuable slaves for $900. Now I want you to think about this. You've got Aaron and Creasy sitting here, and next door, you got a slave auction happening where the notorious slave traders, the Weatherlys from Greensboro, have come. And what if the Weatherlys had looked over, just look next door and say, well, who are those two? they could have upset this whole situation, this whole virtual freedom circumstance that Aaron and Creasy were in. So even though they managed to do it and be safe, there were dangers around every corner. And that's just one of the dangers and threats that I found. Think about it for a moment. What daily unknown dangers and threats that they had to deal with in Staley for 20 years for the Civil War that we would never even know about. Imagine what the existence was like, having those threats daily, that if they crossed the wrong person or stepped out of line in the wrong way, all of their life of virtual freedom could have been shut down. Now, I want to point out two people that in my research I was just very impressed with, and I want to give them credit. This is where I talk about the real commitment. Henry Ellison, one of the trusty friends, he was there on the ground. He moved to Davidson County, but he would check in on Aaron and Creasy. And then there was Joseph Newland, who was a Quaker, and he was a little bit more wealthy. And Henry Ellison was not wealthy at all, and he tried his best, because he was one of the fake slave masters of Aaron and Creasy, to protect them, but they had to pay a poll tax, and they had to pay other taxes that Henry Ellison didn't have the money for. And so Joseph Newland, who was a Quaker and had supported the North Carolina Manumission Society, he heard about Aaron's situation. And so the graphic that I have here is Joseph Newland said he was going to pay the things that things that Henry Ellison couldn't pay for Aaron. And if you see the graphic, it says he's writing to the tax collector in Randolph County. I hereby certify that Joseph Newland has given one black Pole, which I understand to be a slave by the name of Aaron McMasters. And so you got Joseph Newland, who meets Aaron and hears about his story and says, you know what, I'm going to pay the taxes and fees and everything, so that no one can then say, since the taxes for you haven't been paid, that they could somehow sell you somewhere else or move you off of this land. And one of the letters that I have that I find so incredibly moving is Joseph Newland then said, okay, I'm going to help them with money, but I also need to make sure that they're safe, because there are all these dangers and threats. So he tries to make a trip to go from Greensboro to Randolph County, and he tries to stop by Henry Ellison's house. Henry Ellison isn't there. And so he writes Henry Ellison a letter, which I have here, and I included the part that I just think is really touching to me. He goes, I called at thy house with a view that we would go together to see how the McMasters Negroes are doing. But not finding me at home, he goes to say that I went to see them. And the letter continues where he said, I asked them, if they still wanted to stick it out because things were getting more dangerous. And he says that their answer was that they were going to try their best to stay in North Carolina, as dangerous as it was. And he ends the letter by saying, I was happy to see that the McMasters Negroes were joyous under the circumstances. So to wrap up the story, because I want to take your questions, a lot of people say, okay, well, what ended up happening when the Civil War came? Was Aaron ever freed? Was Creasy ever freed? Creasy McMasters, my great-great-great-grandmother, died in 1862, before the end of the Civil War. So she never saw freedom. And then when the Civil War ended, of course, Aaron is now a free man, but that process took a while, because North Carolina, to be admitted back into the Union, they had to reform their constitution and, give rights to everyone. And that took until 1868. And one of the things that Aaron did, in fact, the first thing that Aaron did, once he was freed, he went back to one of those lawyers who fought for his freedom 20 years earlier. This lawyer, by the way, his name was Ralph Gorell. He had retired in Greensboro. He had actually been the treasurer of the Confederacy in Greensboro. Aaron goes to him and says, I know you're retired, but I need you to come out of retirement because I have a lawsuit I want to file. And so, of course, Ralph Gorell says, well, who are you going to sue? Aaron's been free for what, just a few days. Aaron says, I want to sue the trusty friends and all of the McMasters that kept the money that I should have been having. Because keep in mind, Aaron was doing the work, and he had negotiated with them how he would work for them and they could have part of his earnings and everything. He said, now that I'm free, I want to sue them. And so he then files a lawsuit, and it becomes McMasters versus Ellison et al. This lawsuit lasts for 5 years. And it's so interesting when you see the documents, because it's almost that every time it went to court, the judge is like, are you crazy? You just need to be quiet. Like you need to just forgive and forget. Aaron doesn't. He said he wants to see it through. So he said he wants a jury trial. He wants a jury to hear how they took his money and how they owe him money. Well, the day before the trial is supposed to start, Henry Ellison dies. And the money that he was supposed to be keeping for Aaron, it's gone. His widow said that it burned up in a fire. They had invested it in a railroad company and they had the bonds, but the bonds were worthless because they burned up in the fire. And so what the court says to Aaron McMasters, and I'm going to read you the finding. It says, the plaintiff Aaron McMasters and Creasy McMasters, formerly slaves of Simeon McMasters, and for whose benefit the aforesaid trust fund was set apart, have lived upon and enjoyed the land and premises conveyed in the said will to Jesse Kemp and Henry Ellison, those are the fake masters, the trusty friends, ever since the death of the testator Simeon McMasters, without rent, hindrance, or molestation, unto the death of Creasy and unto the present time by the plaintiff Aaron. How interesting is that? That Aaron and Creasy spent over 20 years negotiating with every white person they came in contact with, doing exactly what they said all they needed to do to maintain this very delicate virtual freedom circumstance. And the judge says they lived there without rent, hindrance, or molestation. That was the perspective that happened. That was the prevailing feeling in a lot of places in North Carolina right after the Civil War. So Aaron did not win that lawsuit, but he took it all the way to the end. And I think that kind of shows you a little bit about the stubbornness and determination that he had, and I'm proud that is passed down to my generation and my family. Before I take any of your questions, I just wanted to share a couple of photos here. This is a photo of the Staley Depot, which those of you familiar with Staley, this, right where the railroad tracks kind of like separate there. You see it says Staley up at the top. The African-American man standing in the doorway is Abram McMasters, one of Aaron McMasters' children and my great uncle, okay? The brother of my great grandfather, Amos McMasters. This photo here, you remember I told you about the white child who they found. She ended up, her name was Cynthia, and she's the one seated in the rocking chair. She was hidden with a Quaker family right outside of Cane Creek meeting in Alamance County, and then she was sent to Moore County in the little community of Vass. And once the Civil War was over, she embraced the McMasters name. If you go to her gravestone, she lived until the mid-1920s. It says Cynthia McMasters Phillips, and Edward Phillips is one of the man with the beard seated, and those are some of their children and other family members. And as you can see, Cynthia is clearly mixed race, as light-skinned as she is. And this picture, this is seated is Amos McMasters and his wife, Maggie McMasters, Grandma Maggie. This is one of Aaron's children, who they all lived in that same land that Simeon McMasters, 150 acres, had left. That is my grandmother on the side in the white dress, Mabel McMasters. Then of course there's Aunt Janie, Aunt Fanny, Uncle Radius, and Uriah. So I want to hear your questions. I want to hear your comments. I'm sure that there are lots of things that I mentioned that you know more about than I do, and I want to hear that. Just wanted to put this up before I forget it. If you have any interest in some of the things that I've talked about, you can follow me on social media. My handle on Instagram, Twitter, and everything is Tales Dark Side. My website, which has a lot of this information and other things that I'm involved in, calvindark.com. And then, of course, you can always email me at calvindark.com. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Rita to see if we have any questions, and so I can hear from every one of you.
So there is a question or in the chat asking you to please clarify the North Carolina Supreme Court case decision or decisions regarding the McMaster case circa 1840s.
Well, if you want to look it up, the original case that went to the North Carolina Supreme Court is Miller v. Ellison. John Miller was one of the trustee friends. Henry Ellison was one of the others, and it's Miller versus Ellison et al. And the et al. Are where it lists all of the McMasters family. Started in Randolph, at the county court level in Randolph, but then was appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and the decision, the final decision, Supreme Court came down 1843.
Are there other questions? You can put them in the chat. You can also use the reaction button down at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand if you'd like to come on camera or speak to Calvin. I'll change the view back to gallery so we can see. I have to say, this is a fascinating story. So there is a question. Did you already know about this history when you first saw your ancestors as free on the 1850, I guess, what is that, census? I don't know what that's referring to.
Yeah, this is one of the things. This kind of falls on one of those tips about doing family history and genealogy. Always got to study, and things aren't always as they seem. But at first, I knew about the virtual freedom situation, but I didn't know if Aaron was actually freed. And if I wanted to make the case that he was legally freed somehow, the census would have been a good indication, because he's listed in 1850 and 1860 as a head of a household. The only reason that I know for sure that he wasn't free was when I'm at the North Carolina Archives looking through documents, in boxes of documents that were all mixed together from records of free people of color and enslaved records. I found the Supreme Court records of the case in 1843, and they had also put in there the lawsuit that Aaron had filed once he got freed. And part of that document, his narrative, he talks about how he was never actually freed, and that he's only doing this because it goes on to say, I was freed because of the Constitution of North Carolina of 1868, and then of course the amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So had I not found that, I would have probably made the assumption that he somehow got his freedom during those years, but he didn't. He was virtually free. So that always goes to tell you, never make assumptions as you're doing your genealogy and family history research.
Yeah, Martha Wilcox, hold on just a second, just commented in the chat, thanking you, of course, for the wonderful job and telling this interesting story. And it shows that things are more complicated than we imagine, and certainly is the case. And then there is another question. How did the McMasters kids get educated? Were there schools for African-American children in Chatham?
There were a lot of informal schools, and one of the things that I'm still trying to find a few more details about, you remember I said how in my family education and reading and writing very highly valued. Amos McMasters, my great-grandfather, Aaron's son, I had this teaching certificate from 1899 where he was certified to teach in Randolph County. I know that I'm still trying to find out exactly where he got his education to then apply for the certification. But there were a lot of institutions, Guilford College is one of them, where there was informal training of African Americans and during the Reconstruction period to help them get certified to be teachers to teach in their communities. And if you think about like my grandmother, Mabel McMasters Bowden, Amos's daughter, I don't think she had formal schooling, but they had schooling that took place because she was very educated. I have her, she kept a journal. I have a journal from the 1950s. She writes and spells and articulates better than I ever could. So clearly there was education there, but I think in a lot of places, particularly on Staley, for African Americans, it was informal up until 1910, 1920.
There's another question in the chat. Have you checked the rolls at Shaw? And I'm assuming that's Shaw University.
Yeah, that is on my list. And I've also, there were a lot of what they call normal schools for African American teachers. But I think what's interesting about the teaching certificate from 1899, it doesn't say anything about my great-grandfather's race. It's not like, here's a certificate for a Black teacher. It just says, here's a certificate, he can teach the 3rd grade, up to the 3rd grade in Randolph County. So that's something interesting. I'm still trying to find a little bit more clarification on.
Mm-hmm. I saw someone with their hand raised. Veronica, did you want to ask a question of Calvin?
I do. Hi, Calvin. How you doing?
Hey, cousin,
so my
how you
question
doing?
is this. So I'm doing good. So I'm currently tracing my mother's genealogy, and I'm having a very hard time getting past her great-great-grandfather, which is 1869 or something about that era. I was able to locate when he was a servant, so to speak, for a family in Siler City. And I know he had to be their slave or whatever, because he was the only person of color in the house. They had the husband and the wife and the 3 kids, and they had him listed as a servant. So what's the key to going back further and finding other family members? Because with us, we don't have those records. So what's the trick?
A lot of times people are discouraged, they call it kind of like the 1870 brick wall, because unfortunately, there aren't as many records for African Americans, particularly those that were enslaved. Sometimes they just don't exist. But here's some places you can check. Is one, once you've identified the family, the white family where he lived, look for their probate records and wills. Like I said, you can look on that on Ancestry if you have a subscription there. Also, it's free on Family Search. So to say, for example, the white family that he was with, you can check to see what wills are listed for that family, because a lot of times, because enslaved people were property and they were very valuable pieces of property, you'll find in some wills where it said, that this enslaved person I leave to X. So sometimes you can find the name there. Cemetery and church records are also very good starting points, because a lot of African American churches that existed before the Civil War kept good records. And also I would check, especially if you know the family name and then the enslaved person's first name, I would go to newspapers.com, or there's Digital NC, which is a lot of North Carolina newspapers. The Library of Congress has a newspaper site. Search for the white family names, search for anything that could be related to the name of the enslaved person, and you never know what you might find. I found the wedding announcement for Aaron McMasters there. So, and the other thing too, I would recommend, if you know the county where they were, take a trip to the county, the library. Usually it's in the county seat, not always. A lot of the county seats have genealogy rooms and resources for things that you can't find online. And sometimes you look up and find something that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Okay, great. Now what about, like, my mother, one of her great-great-grandfathers was an Indian, down towards, I guess, the Wilmington area, down that way. Is it as easy to find records for them?
It's different. There are some other challenges there, but one of the things you can do, and some of this is online and some of it's not, the North Carolina State Archives, they have a lot of records for FPOC, free people of color, for Native Americans, and sometimes you can find information there, particularly if you know the county and the year. So the I'm not National Archives, but the State Archives in Raleigh, I would recommend. That's where I found a lot of information for me. And if they happen to be have been involved in any kind of a court or legal case, it's even better because there's a lot of information that would have been recorded about them. So I would also check that as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Calvin.
Yes, thank you.
So I saw Charles Siler, your hand was raised. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Dark. This has been helpful. I am Charles Siler of the Siler City, Silers in Chatham County. I've never lived there. My family moved to Tennessee after the war. I live in, well, just to shorten it up, the previous question was very helpful. It was basically what I was asked to do, how to do research into Black Silers. I'm white, Black Silers. And I'm interested in that because I did the ancestry DNA test, and I've started getting DNA results back from people of color that are that took the test also, and I'm related to them somehow, and it just got me interested in helping find some history be prior to 1870 census, when Blacks weren't listed. I'm also logged on because so many of the names that you've listed are in my genealogy also. I even had a dark in my family tree. I don't remember how it's related, but it's just, I find it all very fascinating. And thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank you, Charles. And take note of my email address, me@calvindark.com. Please send me an email with your contact information because one, I might be in your ancestry genealogy DNA hits. My next writing project that I'm about halfway through is on my father's side of the family. And when you mentioned the Silers, German, of German extraction, the white Silers that were in Siler City, my great grandmother on my father's side, Maggie Siler Dark, and I can share more of this with you, offline. Her parents were slaves, and of course they were freed after Civil War. They had 16 children. And so most of the African Americans in Siler City now, and people who have roots in Siler City, come from one of those 16 children. And when you mentioned that there was a Dark in there, well, that's obviously my last name, and there's a really interesting story of how Darks became Darks, and Siler and the former slaves took the name Siler. So definitely send me an email because I may be one of the DNA matches to you.
That's fascinating. We've got a couple questions in the chat. Mary wants to know if you know how much the $1,000 bond would cost by today's standards. I know it had to be prohibitive, but I'd be interested to know the present day dollar equivalent.
That's actually something that I'm working on coming with a good figure because I really want to be able to convey it in ways that people understand. Right now, I think the best measure I have is, you remember I said Simeon McMasters, his estate was 150 acres of land, right? That's a massive amount of land. That 150 acres was worth about $550. So $1,000 per enslaved person, that goes to show you just how much that would have been, okay? it was out of reach for most folks. So if you think about 150 acres you can have for under $600, that wasn't even close to what it would have taken to have the $1,000 bond. And by the way, as one of the things I mentioned, it was intentionally out of reach because they were trying to, it wasn't to necessarily make money for the local courts. It was to discourage people from freeing the people that they were holding enslaved.
Okay, Marva Price is in the chat and she says, if you have not looked, Rosenwald schools were built in many rural African-American North Carolina communities. My husband is pleased to see where your education has led you and enlightened us. He was your principal at Siler Elementary.
Yes, I do remember, and thank you for with the Rosenwald schools. I've still been looking. I haven't found anything in those records. I'm still looking, and yes, I remember Mr. Price well, fondly.
Okay, Renata, you've got your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Calvin. That was wonderful as always. Thank you for sharing again tonight. I just wanted to know, and you may have said this earlier, do you have a date or estimated date for when the book is going to come out?
Well, and thank you. By the way, you're hearing from, when I have genealogy questions, that's the person I go to. So that is how that's how I definitely think of you. I'm in the editing process now, and I think by the end of the summer it's going to be finished. Hope for a publication date spring of next year. One of the challenges, this is a good challenge, is every time I think I'm done, I find something else, you know?
Yeah.
And so it was frustrating because I'm like, I'm never going to finish writing this, because when I, for example, gave the example of my great-great-aunt Cynthia, the child of the white woman and Aaron McMasters, once I found that out, and of course, I'm like writing that and the significance of that, in doing that research, I found out about the other child by the other white woman. And of course, that's a whole nother chapter and other research has to be done. I got some good advice a couple of years ago that was like, Calvin, the story is history that's alive, and you are never going to be able to find out everything about it. And
that's
so,
right.
Right. And so that kind of made me feel better. It's like, pick a stopping point. And so unless there aren't any more major discoveries, that is the time frame, finish editing and publishing spring of next year.
Okay, and just real quick, I was the one who asked the question about the 1950. And I'm just wondering now, because it's making me wonder so much about all these years of research and just assuming that people that we see on the 50 and I said 19, I mean 1850, people that we see on the 1850 and the 1860, and we're assuming that they're free people of color. But have you heard of this situation happening with any other people of color?
Not specifically, but what you raise is like, that was probably in this research process, the biggest wake-up call to me to not make assumptions. And I struggled with that because what's interesting is if you look at 1850 and 1860, Aaron and his family show up right in between the McMasters who lived around them, right? But as I was talking with a former professor of mine, he said, think about it, the Supreme Court case ended in 1843. So particularly if you think about the 1860 census, there were people probably who were census takers that knew nothing about the scandal and the situation. And if they walk on a property where you've got an African-American with a business, loaning white people money, they're probably just going to assume that they were free people of color. And so I don't know specifically of any other examples, but it did remind me that sometimes census takers, they weren't necessarily genealogists or
right
in what had happened legally. So they made assumptions just as I think we do. So that's something that I think everybody who looks in 1850 and 1860 and they see African Americans, shouldn't necessarily assume that they weren't enslaved, particularly in Central North Carolina, because virtual freedom was a very big thing in North Carolina, where people lived as free. They just never
Yeah.
went through the process of being legally free.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Calvin, I have a couple of quick questions for you. How often does your family get together for reunions? And what is that land? What is there now?
Well, of course, COVID always, throws a wrinkle into family get-togethers.
Yeah.
We try to get together every year. And when I mentioned my cousin, Dr. Howard McMasters, a lot of that land, I'm gonna guess 60, 70 acres of that original land is still in our family. My cousin Howard has restored the house that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, what we call Grandma Maggie's house. And so the houses that were built and then the ones that were built later, like my great Aunt Evie, and others are still there. So one of the things that I love and what kind of inspired me to write is I grew up on that land. I was always fascinated that, when I saw the will and saw the letter that had been framed in Aunt Evie's house, that I was standing on the same ground where all of this was happening. So we are still there, and the road, in case you're familiar with the area, it's called Hannah Mac Road, named for Hannah McMasters, who was the wife of Abram McMasters, Aaron's son. So we're still there.
That's so fascinating. Are there more questions? If so, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. I did forget to mention acknowledge the Friends of the Chatham Community Library who helped make this program possible tonight. So thank you, friends. I know some of you are on the call. Any other questions? Calvin, it has been a pleasure. Oh, Tom's got his hand raised. Go ahead and unmute, Tom.
Calvin, thank you so very much. American history is so fascinating. Go north, get legally free, get your neighbors to let you be virtually free. I appreciate that outline, and it helps me understand how my family was involved in all three of those in Randolph County. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the information you shared. Because of some of the information you and like our Facebook group have, that's one of the reasons why the book isn't finished yet, because just when I think I've learned all the answers, I've learned other connections. So I appreciate it.
Calvin, thank you so much. This was truly fascinating.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And we look forward to meeting in person someday. If you're in the Chatham County area, please come by the library.
I thank you. And I want to just thank you for doing this as part of the observance of Black History Month.
Absolutely.
I want to encourage everybody, I'm very, very fortunate that not only was Aaron McMasters a character and a role model, but he also kept meticulous records. Not everybody's like that. Not everybody has the wealth of manuscripts and photos and paperwork, but I encourage everybody to do the digging, because every family story is unique. Every family story deserves to be told. And I guarantee you, if you start digging, you'll find things that you never imagined, and it will help you know more about who you are and why you are and where you came from. And then you can share it with your family, and it continues and continues.
Well, thank you again, Calvin, and thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.